Age of Empires. Do these words mean anything to you? If you're anything like me, you and maybe a few friends grew up absolutely addicted to at least one of the Age games. Almost everyone I know who was a kid in the early 2000s, the 90s and beyond has come across an Age title at some point in time. An encounter that would most often than not result in a love at first sight. But that's past history, right? Well, what if I were to tell you that not only is Age of Empires still a thing, even the original versions, but now it's the best it's ever been. This is the best time for Age of Empires ever. Let me tell you a bit about how we got here and what Age is looking like today. When Age of Empires first came out in 1997, it was an absolute revelation. People all over the world embraced the game and it soon became an instant classic. As it was the first game to combine proper RTS and history, most other games back in the day were focusing on sci-fi elements instead for RTSs. In addition to that, the game engine was a marvel at the time that allowed Age to run pretty well for the complexity it had on the hardware of the era. 1 year later, Rise of Rome got released, adding extra content to the game, but it was mostly a taming release while the team kept hard at work towards the ambitious sequel Age of Kings. The arrival of Age of Empires 2 in 1999 took the franchise to a whole new level. As a much more robust game, with better graphics, new mechanics, and an iconic soundtrack, Age 2 became the most popular release of the franchise even to this day. The company even hosted a worldwide tournament for it, with a one-afternoon LAN final in Redmond for close to $100,000. Similarly to Rise of Rome, an expansion for Age 2 was also released a year after launching, with the Conquerors bringing additional civilizations and gameplay features. Also, similarly to what happened with Age 1, the Conquerors would be the only expansion for the game released by Ensemble, who would then move on to focus on the development of the next game. A few years went by and the studio's first 3D game, powered by their new Bang game engine, was released, with Age of Mythology arriving in 2002, as a spin-off from the main franchise and its historical setting. The game was well received too, and it quenched the thirst of the community before the eventual release of Age of Empires 3 proper. Age of Mythology would go on to receive one expansion as well a year later in 2003 with the Titans. It took 2 years from then for the long-awaited third installment of the franchise to arrive, and in 2005 Age of Empires 3 was released, which got a pretty positive reception as well. Several critics praised the native multiplayer support and the pretty phenomenal graphics for the time. Unlike the previous entries though, Age 3 received 2 expansion packs, the War Chiefs and the Asian Dynasties. Given the modus operandi from Ensemble, with each subsequent Age game taking place in a progressively more advanced time period, it probably would have been pretty difficult to continue with the franchise without stepping into World War I territory. So naturally, after Age 3, things slowed down significantly for the franchise. Ensemble Studios would go on to release Halo Wars for Xbox 360, and things started looking kinda bleak after the studio disbanded and split into several smaller companies. Not only this, but in terms of competitive support, Microsoft didn't really do much after the 2001 tournament we mentioned before. And if anything were to take place for the games, it was from different organizations, usually as part of multi-game events and featuring comparatively smaller prizes. This on its own, by the way, is a treasure trove of classic Age for anyone willing to dig deep enough to enjoy. At around mid-2006, Gaming Zone, the online platform that the competitive community of the older Microsoft games used to play together and against each other, dropped support for CD-ROM games and many of its community features, and the remaining fans would be left to find other ways to stay connected and enjoy the games together. From this point, and for the best part of the late 2000s, we had what I personally like to refer to as the dark age of the franchise, pardon the pun, since beyond some minor ports that tried to capitalize on the name of the franchise, the only somewhat similar release after Age 3 was Age of Empires Online in 2011, but even that one stopped being developed after less than 2 years from being released. as the free-to-play experiment proved too expensive to maintain due to the small player base. And at this point, things looked pretty grim for the franchise from the outside, as there were seemingly no plans to release new entries, expansions, or even keep support really. The franchise seemed to be kinda dying. Perhaps AoE was just destined to stay as a trilogy? Could it be that a more modern time period wouldn't have captured the spirit of the franchise as well? Maybe RTSs were a thing of the past. Under these circumstances, most other games would probably have died off. But not H. The games were just too good, and every entry still had a very passionate community behind it that would just refuse to let the games go. You see, after Game Zone closed its doors in mid-2006, it didn't take long for third-party services to fill the gap. And with platforms like Game Park, and a few years later, Game Ranger and Voobly, hungry Age fans would find other places to call their home. The community would go on to take on where Microsoft had left off as well, primarily with Age of Empires 2. And even though there were limitations to how much they could achieve without access to the actual source code, where there is a will, there is a way, they say, and the way there was. Talented individuals would go on to release unofficial patches, adding features and optimizations to the game. Modern support was also implemented through Voobly, and people even kept on crowdfunding tournaments for expert players and for viewers to enjoy. Similar things were also true for H1, especially in Vietnam where it was uber popular, and for H3 with the ESO community tournaments. And while there were several developments on the community side of things, too complex for us to dive into in this video, we'll move on to the first re-release directly to keep things simple. In 2012, development for Age of Empires 2 HD began. At this time, it was quite common to see old games get re-released as either full remasters or as updated versions for better compatibility with more modern hardware. Age of Empires 2 was the perfect candidate for this kind of treatment, as it had been the most popular entry in the franchise and it just released as a compatibility update as opposed to a full-fat remake. It couldn't hurt to try, right? If not, just to make the game playable again without the need for third-party tools and unofficial patches. While this was going on behind the scenes, a group of passionate community members had already been working for quite a while on their own little experiment. Trying to see what the limits of the engine were, these fans kept on pushing past simple mods and started working towards an entire new expansion, adding new civilizations into H2 with a level of polish that hadn't been seen before that point. After some time, and once they had something they thought might be good enough to try and release as an official expansion, they approached Microsoft to pitch their work. And they found out the HD version was already in the works. So with an eventual release in 2013 on Steam, HD had a fairly lukewarm reception, as at its core it didn't change the original game enough beyond some minor visual upgrades. However, the native multiplayer browser and lobby system, as well as the Steam Workshop integration, were welcome additions, as they allowed players to connect in the game from within Steam, as well as to distribute and download mods without the need for third-party tools. The mixed reception by the critics didn't stop the international community from absolutely gobbling on the game. Copies were selling really well, and the franchise started picking up steam again. Hot on the heels of HD, the first new official expansion since the Conquerors arrived the same year. The Forgotten, as it was called, brought the fan-made expansion we talked about earlier to the game in the form of the first official expansion for the game in over a decade, with fantastic campaigns and several new civilizations. It was quite clear that the franchise still had a worldwide community of people well willing to invest in the games if done right. So not you, Castle Siege and World Domination, sorry. And so month after month, year after year, the sparkles slowly started growing into what was going to become a blaze. In the next few years, we got a similar re-release for Age of Mythology in 2014, with new expansion Tale of the Dragon to go with it in 2016 as well as the addition to 2 additional expansions for H2 HD with the African Kingdoms and the Rise of the Rajas, arriving in 2015 and 2016 as well. Not only this, but for the first time since 2001's International AoE 2 tournament, we got Microsoft sponsoring a tournament again, with the sponsorship of Battle for Angkor to promote Rise of the Rajas. And here Here's when things get really interesting. With how much momentum the franchise was gaining again, an official announcement was made that a definitive edition version for Age of Empires 1 was coming for the game's 20th anniversary. Shortly after that, a huge announcement happened where it was revealed that definitive editions for Age of Empires 2 and Age of Empires 3 were coming up as well, but most importantly, Microsoft revealed that a fourth release for the franchise would be coming in the future, and everyone lost their minds. The franchise got slung into the spotlight again. The definitive editions brought a proper makeover for the games. Graphically, they look the best they've ever looked before. We got remastered audio for music and sound effects. For Age 2 and 3, multiple DLCs were released after their DE releases, bringing lots of content in the way of new campaigns and civilizations, but also more extensive modding capabilities, which resulted in an incredible amount of community-created content as well. The more consistent updates to the games also resulted in a much more polished experience, as legacy bugs and exploits were finally being fixed. And new quality of life features and balance changes made single-player and online games more balanced. We even got new game modes, such as Battle Royale, Empire Wars, and co-op missions for Age 2, as well as the Tycoon mode for Age of Empires 3. We also got proper support for the games again, with official forums and different ways to report bugs and exploits, which go through an actual support team now. Suffice to say, these were actual remakes, and the reception showed. Age of Empires 4 would go on to release in 2021 after many years in development. A new entry in a franchise with a clear favorite was always going to be difficult, but Age 4 did well with critics and brought a lot of RTS expert players from different Age games and even other franchises together. Given the popularity of Age 2 and the fact that it had over 20 years of community efforts behind it, in addition to all the expansions, Age 4 was never going to compete in terms of sheer content with it. What it brought, though, was a different, more modern approach to a similar time period than Age of Empires 2. The campaigns had phenomenal production value. The civilizations were more different from each other, and it's gotten a lot of support since release. As a matter of fact, it has gone through so many updates since that if you were to play the game today, you would have almost a completely different experience than if you had tried it only on release. A new expansion for it was also recently announced, and it will bring 2 new civilizations to current owners of the game for free, which is a really nice touch. With the addition of mod support, an engine editor, and all the work that was put into it last year, it certainly seems to me that Age of Empires 4 is on the right track to become something truly special on its own right, which I, even as Age of Empires 2 content creator mainly, wholeheartedly root for. A rising tide lifts all boats, right? Last but not least, I would like to share some figures with you in case you're not convinced Age is back and strong. Starting with competitive events. Remember when I mentioned the HD DLC tournament was the first time that Microsoft sponsored an Age tournament again in over a decade? Well, they didn't stop there, and the support behind the competitive aspect of the game grew up steadily afterward. Since the release of Age 2D, we have had major S-tier events basically year-round, with diverse formats and some of the most competitive gameplay that we have seen in a very long time. It keeps the content coming and the community engaged. And things aren't just better for players, by the way, but viewer experience today is miles ahead compared to anything we have had before. It's not just a transition to higher resolution video streams and more widespread high-speed internet, but there is also the fact that the available tools for actually observing and analyzing Age matches are much more sophisticated than just using the in-game spectating mode. As a matter of fact, Microsoft even struck deals with members of the community who worked on third-party game spectating tool CaptureAge to develop a version for Age of Empires 2D, and as it was recently announced, Age 4 as well. Consuming Age is thus miles better today than yesteryear. In terms of money, website eSports Earnings reports that the total prize aggregate for competitive events for Age of Empires 2 since 1999 to 2019 was of a bit more than $1.25 million. And after the got released, the total for 2020 and 2021 alone was of over $1 million. That is over 80% of the total for the 20 years prior to the in just a span of 2 years or 1/10 of the time. And it's not just Microsoft, but the community keeps fueling smaller and more unique events as well, as the sheer amount of events taking place at once since the came out is so much higher than it was ever before. Age of Empires 4 has also had an incredible amount of support behind it in this regard, with well over $400,000 in prizes in less than 1 year since its release. The Red Bull series of tournaments also had a big impact on the perception of Age as a legitimate esports franchise. Its first iteration took place in 2020, and it brought a level of polish and professionalism still rare on the scene. After that, 4 additional editions of Wallow took place, with Red Bull Wallow 5 happening at a real-life castle in a 2021 line chock full of action. It seemed as if things peaked, and it couldn't get any better than that, right? Well, fast forward to mid-2022, and Red Bull Wallow Legacy got announced with a massive event spanning multiple franchise entries. If you're not aware of it, it's got an incredible $550,000 prize pool distributed between tournaments for H1, H2, and H4. This puts 2022 on course to shatter 2021's record as the highest prize pool year for either H game in history. Going back to H1 for a moment, its tournament has already been taking place and got played up until the semifinals, which took place at a very professional looking LAN event in Vietnam, and will have the grand final take place at the castle alongside the main events for Age of Empires 2 and Age of Empires 4. So at this point, I look at the way things are now and think to myself, this must surely be the peak. It can't possibly get any better, right? Well, with a franchise whose most popular game dates well over 20 years and has also had an incredibly stable player base in the last few years in spite of that, as well as massive support behind its latest entry, I guess you never know. I, for one, can only hope this momentum continues and we have many more years of fantastic Age ahead of us. One thing is for sure though, this is simply the best time for Age of Empires. And if you aren't part of it yet, this is also the best time to come back into the franchise, either as a player or just to enjoy the content. Age of Empires. Do these words mean anything to you? If you're anything like me, you're probably still addicted to at least one of the Age games. And with all of us behind it, I'm sure many surprises await us right around the corner. This was a story about a franchise too good to be left behind. And now, it's time to hear your side of the story. Which Age title did you first play or heard of? What was your favorite release? And most importantly, were you aware that the franchise was still active and very much alive? Maybe you were, but you have friends who aren't yet. Share this video with them so they know just how much they've been missing and can join the fun too. Let me add the other notes in the comments and I'll read them all. There were several things that I didn't touch on for this video to keep it a manageable length, such as the ECL moonshot, Voobly's role for many years, and a ton of drama. Those things will have to wait for different videos perhaps? Making videos like this takes a lot of time and effort. Liking and leaving a comment below will show me directly you appreciate the work, and it will help me justify putting the hours behind making more scripted videos like this. If you would like to see match commentary of high-level games, you can find plenty of that on my channel as well. Let me know what kind of content you would like to see next, and until next time, take care and have a good one.